European ministers are meeting today to discuss the ongoing migration crisis across the continent. Several countries have proposed limiting the number of migrants accepted into Europe, and Greece is threatening to take veto against EU-wide agreements if the burden of migration isn't shared across all member states. Well, it comes as new figures reveal net migration into the UK has risen by 31,000 in the last year. Let's get the view now of Nina Schick from the think tank Open Europe. She joins us now live from central London. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us, Nina Schick. Crisis talks then in Brussels on migration, but just how divided is Europe on what needs to be done?
Extremely divided, and the fact is there is no European solution for what to do. When the migration crisis kicked off in the summer, the European idea to solve this was a quota whereby refugees and asylum seekers would be shared across the EU. It's important to point out that the UK wasn't part of this scheme because the UK has an opt-out out of EU asylum policy. But nonetheless, all those countries who are part of EU asylum policy did not want to do that. It was an idea that was pushed forward by Germany. We saw the Central and Eastern European countries pushing against it. And I think out of a quota of 160,000 asylum seekers that were supposed to be redistributed around the EU over a course of 7 months, about 300 or 400 have actually been shared around. So it's not working. And the main problem is that the EU's external border is not protected. And you have a continent now facing a massive influx of people, the biggest movement of people we've seen since the Second World War. A lot of those are people fleeing from war, the war in Syria, but also you have a lot of people coming from other parts of the world, illegal economic migrants. And because the influx has been so great, there simply is no way to control it. And I don't think in all my years of observing the EU, I have seen the countries so split and divided on an issue as they have been on the migration crisis.
Well, yes, and you've heard some strong words as well from some of the leaders, haven't you? In Greece, Alexis Tsipras, their leader, has talked about the country turning into a permanent warehouse of souls. They're concerned about the backlog of refugees that are building up in Greece. And he says that he could veto future decisions made at EU summits unless this problem is addressed. I mean, this really could cause problems for Europe.
Absolutely. I mean, Greece is on the front line of the migration crisis. A lot of migrants coming go via the Balkan route and end up in Greece. This is where most of the people are coming from. And because Greece has not been able to protect its external border and has simply been letting people pass through and waving them on to Germany, other countries in between now have shut down their borders, put temporary controls in place. And there's even talk about Greece being kicked out of Schengen, which is the border-free travel movement within the EU. And of course, they're terrified now. They're already suffering an economic crisis. And the idea that they might be kicked out of Schengen, of course, the Prime Minister Tsipras is now saying, look, unless you help us with this burden, then what he's actually doing is threatening to veto any other decisions, because of course, at the level of the EU 28, each of the member states has a veto. So he's being deliberately obstructive because he's afraid that Greece might be kicked out of Schengen and that Greece might be left with this burden. It simply cannot deal with it.
And different countries are taking different actions, aren't they, and introducing certain border controls. Some are putting up fences along some of their borders as well. To what extent does this impact on the idea of free movement in Europe, which is one of its founding principles, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very important to distinguish that free movement is quite different from the migration crisis that we're seeing right now. Free movement is the right for EU citizens to travel and live around the EU. This migration crisis, as I said, has a lot to do with illegal economic immigrants and also asylum seekers, and where they end up in the EU. So they're two separate issues that are being conflated in a way that isn't exactly true. And it's important to point out once again that the UK does not have to partake in EU asylum policy. So in a way, the UK is set aside from this. It's true that asylum applications are up in the UK, but it's nowhere near what we're seeing in the rest of the EU, where 1.1 million people arrived in Germany. So what we've been seeing is countries within Schengen, of which the UK is not a part, putting up temporary border controls. And also we've seen countries like Austria, Hungary, the Central and Eastern European countries saying, we don't want to take part in this quota to share asylum seekers across the EU. So it's many, many issues being conflated into one, and the EU is struggling to find a response. And in many ways, it's quite difficult for them to do so because this, of course, is a global phenomenon. And because of the proximity of the EU to the turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa, it's bearing the brunt of it.
OK, Nina Schick from Open Europe, thank you.